Adelinde was holding the king's mending kit when the wax cracked on the last page of the Ember Roll for the third time. She had not meant to be in the great hall at all. Lord Halston's sleeve had torn at the elbow seam not an hour before the doors were sealed for the Ember Court, and someone had to fix it before he stood before the king in front of the whole castle, and the someone had been her, kneeling behind a pillar with a needle and a length of grey thread, while 200 and some candles burned down toward the night's ceremony. By the time she had finished the seam, the doors were shut. She had stayed where she was, in the shadow at the back of the hall, because there was nowhere else to go, and because no one in that room would have noticed her regardless. The Ember Court happened once a year, on the longest night, and it had happened the same way for 216 years. The king took the Ember Roll, the great iron-bound ledger that recorded every debt owed to the crown, and one, by candlelight, he pressed his signet into a disk of hot wax laid across each cleared entry, sealing it shut for good. 216 years, and the wax had never once failed to take the seal. It was the kind of fact people in Brackenhollow repeated the way they repeated the shape of the castle or the names of the rivers. True, because it had always been true, and unremarkable for exactly that reason. Adelinde had watched 215 pages seal that night, each one a soft hiss and a curl of smoke, and the king's low, unhurried voice reading a name before the wax went down. King Baldric did this himself every year, though there were clerks who could have done it faster. He was a big man, black-haired, built the way a door is built, rather than the way a wall is, made to be used, not admired. And even from the back of the hall, Adelinde could feel the room arranging itself around him, without anyone seeming to decide to do it. When he moved his hand toward the brazier for the wax, 300 people in that hall watched his hand. Cressida Vane, keeper of the rolls, stood at his right shoulder with the ledger open across her forearms, turning each page after it sealed, murmuring the next name before he asked for it. She had held the post for 7 years and wore it the way some women wore jewelry, visibly, comfortably, as proof of something. Her voice was the kind that made forms feel like courtesies. The 216th entry was the last one of the night. Cressida read the name. The king pressed the seal. The wax held for a heartbeat, and then split clean across the middle, the two halves curling away from each other like burned paper, and a thin grey thread of smoke rose up where it had not been asked to. A ripple went through the hall, not loud, just a held breath passed from person to person. The king looked at the broken wax for a moment, without expression. Then he reached for another wafer of wax from the dish beside him and pressed it down again. It cracked again. The same way, clean down the centre. Adelinde, from the back of the hall, did the only thing she knew how to do when something went wrong around her. She finished what was in her hands. She folded Lord Halston's spare doublet, the one she had been holding while she waited for him to need it again, along its seams, smoothed the fold flat with the side of her hand, and set it on the bench beside her. Her fingers, when she did it, moved the way they always did, careful around the small white scars at each fingertip, a lifetime of needles that had not always gone where she meant them to. Again, the king said. The third time, the wax did not even hold for a heartbeat. It cracked the instant his ring touched it, and this time the split went all the way to the edges of the wafer and stayed split, 2 clean halves sitting on either side of the entry, like a door someone had opened and refused to close. For the first time since the ceremony began, King Baldric's eyes lifted from the ledger. He looked at Cressida Vane. "Whose entry is this?" Cressida's composure did not break. It simply paused, a half-second where her eyes went, very briefly, to the back of the hall, to the shadow behind the pillar, before they came back to the page in front of her, smooth and unhurried. "A flawed entry, Your Grace. Old ink, likely. These things happen, in 2 centuries of records. A page goes brittle, the wax won't. "Read the name," the king said, and Adelinde, watching from the dark at the edge of 300 candles, understood, without yet knowing why, without anyone having told her anything, that the half-second Cressida Vane's eyes had spent on her was the first time in 7 years anyone in that hall had looked at her on purpose. The king read the name himself, Joran of the Mending Hall, surety standing, his daughter. He looked up from the page and into the hall, at no one in particular, the way a man looks when he is asking a question he expects no answer to. Who stands surety on this entry? The silence that followed was not the kind that happens because no one heard. It was the kind that happens because everyone did. Adelinde set down the spool of thread she had still been holding. She stepped out from behind the pillar into the candlelight, in her mending apron with its row of pins along the hem and the small dark stains of wax and dye that never fully washed out, and she said, in a voice that did not shake, because she had spent a long time teaching it not to, "I do. He was my father." 300 people turned to look at a woman most of them had never seen before in their lives, in a room where, 216 years running, nothing had ever gone wrong. The king looked at her for a long moment, not the way a king looks at a servant who has spoken out of turn, the way a man looks at the only unbroken thing in a room full of things that have just, very quietly, broken. "Bring the roll to the table," he said to Cressida, without looking away from Adelinde. "This page is not to be touched again tonight. I want the keeper of the old archive to examine it before any further attempt is made." Cressida Vane closed the ledger over her own hands, gently, the way a person closes a door they intend to open again later when no one is watching. "Of course, Your Grace," she said, and smiled, and the smile did not reach anywhere near her eyes. Adelinde stood very still in the candlelight, in front of everyone, and did the thing she did when she did not know what else to do. She pressed the pad of her thumb very lightly against the small scars at the tips of her first 2 fingers, one, then the other, then the first again, counting something only she could feel, until the king turned away to dismiss the hall, and the moment, at last, let her go. The doors of the great hall were not opened again until well past midnight, and by then the wax on the broken page had cooled into 2 separate halves that no one had moved, sitting on either side of her father's name like the page itself was waiting for someone to decide what it meant. Master Theron had kept the old archive for 40 years, longer than anyone currently serving in the castle had been alive, and he received the summons to examine the broken page the way he received most things, without surprise and without hurry. He was a small, stooped man with ink permanently worked into the creases of his knuckles, and he had stopped, decades ago, caring about which doors he was or was not supposed to walk through. He arrived at the great hall before dawn, while the candles were still being relit, and stood over the broken wax for a long time without touching it. 216 years, he said, eventually, to no one. Not once. Not so much as a hairline crack in 216 years. And tonight it failed 3 times on the same name in front of the entire court. "What does it mean?" Baldric asked. He had not gone to his rooms. He had sent everyone else away and remained in the hall, in the dark, with the broken page, the way a man stays in a room after an argument he has not finished having. "It means," Theron said, "that the Ember Roll is older than anyone now living understands it to be, and that it does not seal a debt closed unless the debt is, in truth, settled. Not recorded as settled. Settled." He looked up. "In 216 years, Your Grace, the roll and the record have never once disagreed, until tonight. So either the roll is lying," Baldric said, "or the record is." "The roll has never lied," Theron said. "Not once, not in 216 years. Baldric looked down at the 2 halves of broken wax, sitting on either side of a name that belonged to a woman he had spoken 4 sentences to in his entire life, and felt something he did not have a category for. A low, persistent pull, like a string drawn taut somewhere behind his sternum, toward a room at the bottom of the castle he had never had any reason to visit. He told himself it was curiosity. He had been telling himself things were curiosity for as long as he could remember, not believing it. He found, in the days that followed, that he kept returning to one detail from that night. Not the broken wax itself, which everyone in the hall had seen, but the moment just after it. While 300 people stared at 2 halves of cracked wax sitting on a page that had never cracked before, one woman at the back of the hall had simply finished folding the doublet she had been holding, smoothed it flat along its seams, and set it down on the bench beside her, as though the room had not just done something it had never done in 2 centuries. No one else in the hall had moved. He had noticed because, for reasons he could not yet account for, he had not been watching the wax. He had been watching her. The mending hall was 3 floors below the kitchens, in the part of the castle that had no name on any map because no one who mattered had ever needed to find it. It smelled of wax, dye, and old wool, and it was where Adelinde had worked since she was 11 years old, mending the things that tore, robes, banners, bed linens, the hems of people who never looked down at the women fixing them. She had not slept. She sat at her bench before the rest of the hall had woken, with her father's debt token in her hand, turning it over the way she had turned it over every night, for as long as she could remember owning it. It was a flat disc of old bronze, no larger than a coin, worn smooth at the edges from years of handling. Stamped into its face was a closed fist, fingers wrapped around a single thread that ran from the fist to the disc's rim and stopped there, as though the thread continued somewhere the bronze did not show. Every indentured family in Brackenhollow wore one, a surety mark, proof that a name in the Ember Roll had a living person standing behind it. Adelinde's had been her father's, and then it had been hers, worn on a cord against her collarbone since she was 9 years old, and it had always, for as long as she could remember, been faintly warm, warmer than a piece of metal worn against skin had any right to be. She had never told anyone that. There had never seemed to be a point. The door at the top of the mending hall stairs opened, and the room went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when someone enters it who has never entered it before. A King Baldric had to duck under the doorframe. He did not look as though he belonged in the room, and he did not pretend otherwise. He stood just inside the door for a moment, taking in the benches, the baskets of folded linen, the women who had all gone very still over their work, with the unhurried attention of a man who did not often find himself somewhere he had to look around to understand. "Adelinde," he said. It was the first time she had heard him say her name. He must have asked someone for it. "Your Grace." She stood, because it seemed required, though her hands stayed at her sides, and she did not look away from him, which she understood, distantly, the way one understands a fact about weather, was probably not what was expected of her either. "How long has your family's name been in the roll?" "Since before I was born, Your Grace, my father's debt, then mine, after." "I didn't know that," he said. "That it could pass to a child. Most people don't ask," Adelinde said. "There's no reason to." He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the mending hall had resumed its work in the particular hush of people pretending very hard not to listen. "What is that?" he said, and nodded toward her collar, where the bronze disc sat against the fabric of her dress. "If I may." She lifted the cord over her head and held it out to him, not because she had been asked to hand it over, but because it seemed simpler than explaining it from a distance, and because some part of her, the part that had spent a lifetime being looked through, wanted, just once, to be looked at properly. He took it, and his fingers brushed the inside of her wrist as he did, and neither of them moved for the length of one breath. The disc sat in his palm, and even from where she stood, Adelinde saw something cross his face, Not recognition, not yet, but the particular stillness of a man noticing something he has no explanation for and choosing, for the moment, not to ask the question out loud. "It's warm," he said. "It always has been." He turned it over once, looked at the closed fist and the thread that ran off the edge of the bronze and stopped, and handed it back to her. Careful, the way a person hands back something they suspect might matter, more than they have been told. "Master Theron will want to see this," he said. "Not today. Soon." "Of course, Your Grace." He looked at her for a moment longer than the conversation required. The way a man looks at a door he has just noticed was unlocked the whole time, and then he left, ducking under the frame again, and the mending hall did not resume its ordinary noise for several minutes after the door closed. Adelinde sat back down at her bench, put the cord back over her head, and found that the disc against her skin felt, for the first time in her life, different. Not warmer, just noticed, as though it too had been waiting a long time for someone to ask. She did not see him again that day. She saw him the next morning instead, standing at the bottom of the mending hall stairs with no apparent reason to be there, and the morning after that, and by the third morning, no one in the hall pretended to be surprised any more, though no one said anything either. The council convened 4 days after the Ember Court, and Cressida Vane was the one who raised the matter of the broken page. She did it carefully and reasonably, and entirely within the bounds of 2 centuries of precedent. An entry under active examination, she explained, was an entry whose surety status was, by definition, unresolved, and an unresolved surety, under the old indenture statutes, was required to be held under close supervision until the matter was settled, to prevent any possibility of the surety absenting herself before her obligations could be determined. No one on the council objected. Several of them owed Cressida Vane things they did not discuss, and the rest simply could not find, in the careful shape of her argument, anything to object to. It was, after all, only a precaution. It was only procedure. By that evening, Adelinde's belongings had been moved from the mending hall's sleeping quarters to a locked chamber on the 3rd floor of the keep. A small stone room with one narrow window, a door with a bar on the outside, and a guard who did not meet her eyes when he locked it. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, in the dark, with her father's debt token in her hand, and felt 2 things at once that did not belong together and would not leave. She was furious, a cold, careful fury, the kind that did not show on her face, because she had spent her whole life making sure nothing showed on her face, and underneath the fury, absurdly, she was relieved. Someone, finally, was looking at the page, even if the looking had put her in a locked room. So it was the first time in 7 years that anyone in this castle had treated her father's name as though it meant something. She did not know what to do with being furious and relieved by the same thing. She sat with both of them until the candle burned down. What Master Theron found over the following days, he found slowly, and he found it the way he found everything, by following the handwriting. 7 years ago, the keeper of the rolls had not been Cressida Vane. It had been an old man named Osric Pell, who had held the post for 30 years and died suddenly in his sleep, in the same season that his successor was appointed. Theron remembered him as meticulous to the point of irritation, a man who recorded the date and the witness for every payment, and in a hand so consistent that forging it would have required years of practice no one would have had reason to undertake. In Pell's personal effects, boxes that had sat untouched in the lower archive for 7 years because no one had ever asked for them, Theron found a ledger, not the Ember Roll, a private accounting book, the kind a careful man keeps for himself in case the official record is ever questioned. In it, dated 7 years before the Ember Court that had just passed, in Osric Pell's unmistakable hand, was a record of final payment received against the debt of Joran, of the mending hall, paid in full, witnessed, the debt extinguished. The Ember Roll, the official record, did not contain this entry. The Ember Roll showed the debt as active, ongoing, accruing, and for 7 years, a portion of Adelinde's wages had been deducted against an obligation that, according to the only honest ledger Theron could find, had not existed since she was a child. Theron did not go to the council with this. He went to Baldric, alone, at night, and laid both ledgers on the table side by side, and said nothing at all, because there was nothing that needed saying. Baldric read Osric Pell's entry 3 times. Then he asked very quietly how many other names might be sitting in the Ember Roll the same way, debts the record called active, that a dead man's private hand said had been paid. "I don't know yet," Theron said, "but your grace, I would not move yet. Not until we are certain, and not until the proof cannot simply disappear the moment someone realizes we are looking for it." Whoever altered the official roll had 7 years to be careful. We will have one chance to not be careless in return. It cost Baldric something to agree to wait. He did not say so. He had Adelinde's locked chamber's window seal checked the next morning. A draft, he told the steward, nothing more, and had her moved, without ceremony, to a larger room 2 floors up, still locked, still guarded, but with a hearth that drew properly and a window that did not let the wind in sideways. He told himself it was a small correction. He did not examine very closely why it had felt necessary to make it himself. It was from that window, 3 nights later, that Adelinde saw him. She had not been able to sleep. The castle below was dark, except for the Roll's office, 2 floors down and across the courtyard, where a single window stayed lit long past the hour any honest clerk should have still been working. She had been watching that window for almost an hour without knowing quite why, when she realized there was a man standing in the courtyard below her own window, alone, in the cold, looking up at the same lit room. He had no cloak. He stood with his arms loosely crossed, very still, the way a man stands when he has stopped pretending to himself that he's about to go inside. Adelinde watched him for a long time. He did not move, and the lit window across the courtyard did not go dark, and after a while she understood, not with any sense of discovery, and just the way one understands something that has been true for a while before you noticed it, that the most powerful man in Brackenhollow was standing outside in the cold at an hour past midnight, watching a lit window, because there was something happening behind it that he could not yet do anything about, and he did not know what else to do with that, except stand where he could see it. She thought about the broken wax. She thought about 7 years of wages. She thought about a dead man's careful handwriting, which she did not yet know existed, and somehow, looking down at Baldric standing alone in the dark, she felt the shape of it anyway, the sense that something true had been buried a long time ago by someone who was very good at burying things, and that the truth was, slowly, working its way back up regardless. She did not call down to him. He did not look up. After a while he went back inside, and so did she, and neither of them mentioned it the next morning, though when he came to the base of the stairs the following day, he had stopped pretending he needed a reason. He had not shaved, and there were shadows under his eyes that had not been there before, and Adelinde found that she could not look at him without thinking of the courtyard, and the cold, and the lit window, and the particular loneliness of a man who could order anyone in the castle to do anything except the one thing he actually needed. The guards came for her 2 mornings later. There were 4 of them, and the man leading them carried a paper with 3 council signatures on it, a reassessment, he said, of the prisoner's security classification, in light of the ongoing irregularity. The locked room, he said, was no longer considered sufficient. There was a cell in the lower keep that would serve better. Adelinde stood very still while he said this, the way she had learned to stand still a very long time ago, and pressed her thumb against the scars on her fingertips, one, then the other, then the first again, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say to 4 men with a paper and 3 signatures. One of them took her arm, not gently, to bring her to the door, and that was when Baldric arrived. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The corridor, which had been full of the particular noise 4 armed men make when they are following orders they have not questioned, went silent the moment he stepped into it, and the guard's hand left Adelinde's arm before anyone had told him to remove it. "Whose order?" Baldric said. "The Council's, Your Grace. A reassessment, given the—" "I am aware of the Council's authority over prisoner classifications," Baldric said, in the same unhurried voice he used for everything, which made it worse. "I am asking whose order. A name." The guard did not have a name that improved his situation, and after a moment of silence that went on slightly too long, Baldric's arm came around Adelinde's shoulders. Not a command, not a display, simply the most direct way of putting himself between her and 4 men with a paper, and drew her back against him out of the doorway. He did not say anything to her. He did not look down at her. His arm stayed where it was for one long moment, solid, and she felt, absurdly, the warmth of the bronze disc against her collarbone where it sat between them, and then he released her without comment and turned back to the guards. "This woman remains in her current quarters," he said. "If the Council wishes to discuss her classification further, they may discuss it with me, personally." The guards left. Adelinde stood in the doorway for a long moment after they had gone, very aware of the place on her shoulder where his arm had been, and told herself that whatever she was feeling was simply the aftermath of being frightened. She did not entirely believe herself. She had gotten very good over the years at not entirely believing herself, and had never minded it before. That night she took her mending shears to the lining of her apron, the apron she had worn every working day for 11 years, so the one with the row of pins along the hem and the stains that never washed out, and cut along a seam she had sewn herself as a child on the night of her father's funeral and had never opened since. Inside was a single folded paper, soft with age, in her father's hand. It was not the receipt. It was a note, short, plain, the handwriting of a man who had not expected anyone to need to read it for a long time. It named Osric Pell. It said that Pell had given him a marked receipt the night the debt was finally cleared, and that her father had hidden a copy, in case. The note did not finish the sentence. It simply trailed off, the way a sentence trails off when the person writing it runs out of certainty about what kind of trouble he is preparing for. Adelinde read it 3 times. Then she folded it back along its old creases, and the next morning, when Baldric came to the bottom of the stairs, she went down to meet him before he could speak, and held it out. "My father left this," she said. "I think it matters." He read it standing where he was, and something in his face changed. Not surprise, exactly. The look of a man watching the last piece of a shape he had already half seen settle into place. "Master Theron," he said, "is going to want to see this immediately." He was right. Within 2 days, in the binding of an old private ledger that had sat in a box in the lower archive for 7 years, Master Theron found a second copy of Osric Pell's receipt, folded small, slipped between the boards and the leather, the way a careful man hides something he hopes never to need, written and witnessed and dated, in ink that had not faded, so naming Joran of the mending hall, debt extinguished, in full. The council reconvened 6 days after the Ember Court, in the same great hall, with the Ember Roll once again open on the table, and this time Adelinde was not standing at the back of the room. She walked in, beside Master Theron, in her mending apron, with the receipt in one hand, and her father's debt token in the other, and set both of them on the table in front of the council, in front of Cressida Vane, in front of the king. For a moment, before the doors had fully opened, there had been another moment, in the antechamber, with no one else present, when Baldric had turned to her and started to say something, and she had turned toward him, ready to hear it, and the doors had opened before either of them got further than that. He had not finished the sentence, and neither of them, afterward, seemed to know how to get back to it, and for the length of the walk to the table, it sat between them, unfinished, the way unfinished things do. Adelinde set the receipt down first. 7 years ago, she said, my father's debt was paid in full. This is the receipt. It is in the hand of Osric Pell, who held the post of Keeper of the Rolls at the time, and it is witnessed. She set the debt token down beside it. For 7 years, wages have been deducted from me against a debt that, according to this document, did not exist. I would like the council to explain the discrepancy. She did not raise her voice. She did not look away from anyone. The room, which had been full of the particular rustle of people settling into their seats, went very quiet, and stayed that way. Now Master Theron laid Osric Pell's private ledger beside the receipt, open to the relevant page, and beside that, the Ember Roll itself, open to the same entry, the one that had cracked 3 times 6 nights ago. 2 ledgers, Theron said, to the council, in the dry, unhurried voice of a man who had spent 40 years being patient with people who did not read carefully enough. One says the debt was paid, one says it was not. Osric Pell kept meticulous records for 30 years, and his hand does not change. I would ask the council to examine both, and to ask itself which hand has reason to be careful, and which has reason not to be looked at too closely. Cressida Vane did not move. For a long moment, her face held the same smooth, reasonable expression it had held for 7 years, and then, very briefly, and something underneath it showed through. Not anger, not the cold contempt of a woman caught and unbowed, but something smaller and more honest. Fear. The particular fear of someone who has spent a long time being careful, watching the carefulness come apart in front of witnesses who will remember exactly how it looked. This is one entry, she said, and her voice, for the first time in 7 years that anyone could recall, was not entirely steady. One discrepancy in 2 centuries of records proves nothing about— It is not one entry, Theron said. I would not have brought this before the council on the strength of one entry. I have spent 6 days, Your Grace, examining the Ember Roll against every private account I could find from the last 7 years. There are 11 other entries, 11 other families, where the pattern is identical. A debt recorded as paid in a private hand, and recorded as active in the official roll, with the difference quietly deducted every year into an account that does not appear in any record the council has ever been shown. He did not say whose account. He did not need to. The council's vote, when it came, was not dramatic. There was no shouting, no dramatic unmasking, no moment of theatrical collapse. There was simply a reading of the findings, a brief and uncomfortable silence, and a vote. Unanimous in the end, because by that point there was nothing left to vote for except the truth. To suspend Cressida Vane from the office of Keeper of the Rolls, pending a full audit of every entry in the Ember Roll for the past 7 years, could to be conducted under Master Theron's oversight. Cressida Vane was escorted from the hall by 2 of the same guards who, 6 days earlier, had come to move Adelinde to a cell. She did not look at the council as she went. She looked once at Adelinde, not with hatred, which Adelinde had braced for, but with something that looked almost like recalculation, as though she were only now, for the first time, working out what kind of woman had been standing at the back of the hall all those years, unnoticed, while she did her sums. When the hall had quieted, Baldric stood and took up a fresh wafer of wax, and pressed it himself against the page that had broken 3 times. The page that now read, in Master Theron's careful new hand beside the old entry, debt extinguished 7 years prior, deducted wages to be restored in full, with surety released. The wax took the seal on the first attempt. It held cleanly, the way it had held for 215 pages before it, the way it would hold, presumably, for the next 216 years, now that what it sealed was true. No one in the hall said anything about it. There was nothing to say. The thing that had broken had been a record, not the roll. And the roll, Adelinde understood, watching the wax cool clean and whole under the king's hand, had been right all along. The audit took the better part of a month, and what it found was worse than 11 families. By the time Master Theron's clerks had finished, there were 19 names. 19 debts the official record called active, that a quieter, more honest hand had called settled, 7 years' worth of quietly redirected wages that restored, amounted to a sum large enough that several of the families involved would, for the first time in a generation, own the small houses they had spent their lives renting from the crown that had never told them their debts were paid. Cressida Vane was not executed, and she was not exiled. She was confined, under guard, in a set of rooms considerably smaller and considerably less comfortable than the ones she had occupied as keeper of the rolls, to await a formal judgment that Baldric was, by all accounts, taking his time over. "Because I am tired," he told Garrick, his marshal, the one evening the subject came up, "of things ending in fire. She will have a long time to think about exactly how this was found, and exactly who found it, and what that means about the kind of woman she decided was safe to overlook." Garrick, who had been the first person in the castle, besides the king, to start addressing Adelinde by name rather than by what she did, said only that he thought that was about right, and left it there. Weeks passed, the way weeks do when the largest thing that has ever happened to a person quietly stops being the largest thing and becomes instead simply part of how things are now. Adelinde went back to the mending hall. She had been offered other things, a position in the rolls office, overseeing the audit alongside Master Theron, a formal household appointment with a title attached to it, and she had turned down the title, though not the work. 2 mornings a week she sat with Theron and went through old entries, to checking handwriting against handwriting, and the rest of the week she mended what tore, the way she always had, because it was work she was good at and work she liked, and because, she told Theron, when he asked, with the faint surprise of a man who had assumed she would want to leave it behind, there was no reason being right about one thing should mean she had to stop being herself about everything else. Her hands still bore the small white scars from a decade of needles. She still pressed her thumb against them, sometimes when something mattered, though less often now, and for shorter stretches, the way a habit fades when the thing it used to guard against stops happening as often. Baldric still came to the bottom of the mending hall stairs most mornings. No one in the hall pretended to be surprised by it any more, and a few of the women had started, very quietly, placing bets on how long it would take him to come up with a reason that was not, in fact, a reason. One morning, early, before the rest of the hall had woken, Adelinde found him in the practice yard instead. She had gone the long way to fetch water, past the yard rather than through the kitchens, for no reason she examined too closely. And he was there alone, in the grey half-light before dawn, his shirt discarded over the fence rail, working through the kind of drills that had nothing to do with an audience. She saw, in that light, what the court never saw, the old scar across his collarbone continuing down across his chest, silver with age, and the particular stillness of his movements between strikes. A man who did not fidget, even when no one was watching. It's because there had never been a version of him that fidgeted. He saw her and stopped, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the not saying was its own kind of conversation. "You're up early," he said eventually. "So are you." "I often am." He reached for his shirt, unhurried. "I find I sleep better than I used to. I'm not certain why." "I could think of a reason," Adelinde said, "if you wanted one." He looked at her for a long moment. The same look he had given her in the mending hall the first morning, the look of a man noticing something he had no explanation for, and choosing not to ask the question out loud. Except this time, he did ask. "That morning," he said, The first morning, after the Ember Court. I told myself I came down to see whether the broken wax had something to do with you specifically, or whether it was simply true, regardless of who was standing there. He pulled the shirt on, slow. I never actually needed to know which it was. I think I knew, by the second morning, that I just wanted a reason to come back. Adelinde set down the water bucket. "That's the most honest thing I've ever heard you say," she said, "and you said it like a report." "I've been told that's how I say most things that matter," he said, and something in his face, not quite a smile, something quieter than that, moved. "I'm told it's how I show I mean them." "I know," she said. "I've started to be able to tell the difference." He crossed the space between them, unhurried, the way he did everything, and put his forehead against hers. No words the way he had done it once before, in the antechamber outside the council hall. In the silence after everything had been decided, and before either of them had known what to do with the quiet that followed. She did not move. Neither did he, for a long moment, and the bronze disc at her collar sat warm between them. Ordinary now, the way the impossible becomes ordinary, once enough mornings have happened on top of it. Then he kissed her, once careful, the kind of kiss that had clearly been considered from several angles, by a man who did not do anything without considering it first, and had been worth the consideration. Neither of them said anything else. There was nothing that needed saying that the morning itself was not already saying. The grey light coming up over the practice yard, the water bucket sitting where she had set it down, is the bronze disc at her collar that had been warm for as long as she could remember, and had finally, quietly, stopped being the only thing about her that anyone noticed. She picked the bucket back up. He fell into step beside her, toward the kitchens, in no particular hurry, and somewhere behind them, in the great hall, 216 sealed pages, and one newly sealed page, sat closed in the Ember Roll, true from the first word to the last, the way they always should have been. If you found out, years from now, that something taken from you had quietly been taken back without your knowledge, and that the only proof left was a single page in a book no one thought to check, would you want it found, even if finding it meant everyone would finally have to look at you? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. Until next time.